Support for PhillyCentric comes from Squarespace. Squarespace, for credit card processing on phone and mobile devices. Visit www.squarespace.com/PhillyCentric for a special code providing special offers. PhD and Pearl Productions, this is PhillyCentric. One story told a week at a time. Philadelphia Execution. A true story of murder and American justice by Hay Benny. Episode 2, The Trial Characters. On Friday morning, we heard closing arguments. Each attorney did a good job summarizing the major aspects of their respective case. Both stared into our eyes while making their closing arguments. This conversational tactic did impose emotional empathy, but I have studied communicative rhetorical practices in my past, and personally, I felt like I knew what they were up to. I saw an interview with someone who once had an important meeting with President Clinton, and he said that Clinton never took his eyes off of him. Even while drinking from a glass of water, Clinton stared at this person's eyes through the bottom of his drinking glass. We were then read jury instructions and asked to deliberate to try to reach verdicts on 4 specific counts: first-degree murder or third-degree murder, illegal possession of a handgun, intimidating a witness, and intimidating a witness with the offer of money. I didn't get a good night's sleep for most of the week. On Thursday night, the knowledge that we could be deliberating the following day weighed heavily on my mind. I kept going over the trial and witness testimonies in my head. In a few hours, I would be part of the deliberations trying to decide if the maximum punitive sentence that the Commonwealth allows on a juvenile could be imposed. It was a heavy responsibility, and I felt it. I wanted to do the right thing, whatever that was. I thought that if I took the case apart, bit by bit, and independently evaluated all the evidence and contrasted those conclusions against the judge's jury instructions, that I would have the best chance at making the best possible decision. I was also falling behind in my personal responsibilities outside of this matter, and that crossed my mind as I tried to get to sleep. Clearly there was evidence solidly implicating the defendant, but the defense often raised credibilities with this evidence. A motive was never clearly put forth. Was there enough here to put this young adult away for the prime of his life? Maybe he was guilty, but maybe the Commonwealth didn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Maybe the Commonwealth dragged a case into court prematurely without enough evidence to get a conviction. Maybe there was enough evidence. All these thoughts were running through my mind. I also knew one of our first tasks would be to assign a jury foreman. I've had extensive experience running multi-million-dollar information technology projects in the corporate business world. These projects typically had multiple vendors, all with their own agenda. I had to manage these resources toward a common goal of achieving defined project objectives, on or ahead of schedule, on or under budget. I also have graduate degrees and am well versed in many areas of organizational behavior. I felt I could do a good job as a jury foreman, but I also felt there were other jurors who were equally capable. There were a couple of jurors that I would not have liked to see in that role, but the majority I thought could do a good job at it, including myself. I also didn't see the jury foreman as being a very powerful position. I'd be first an equal juror, and secondly its foreman. If I were the foreman, I would engage in tasks like requesting materials from the judge, asking if people could go out on a smoking break, asking when meals were to be served, and verbalizing our deliberation status to the court if necessary. It really was a functional role more than an authoritative position. At least that was how I viewed it. When we were finally led into the jury room for our deliberations, sometime between 10:30 and 11 a.m. on Friday morning, I felt emotionally drained. I think the rest of the jury had similar feelings. It was a grisly, deadly, bloody, violent crime committed on a youth before his life even got started. The defendant was a juvenile at the time of the crime and was also just entering adulthood. How someone so young could do something so violent was difficult to comprehend. Besides being chilling and horrific, the entire event was just profoundly sad. One young life was forever lost, and we were deliberating if another should be put away for the majority of his. Outside, I did not shed a tear, but inside, my soul was troubled. Our jury consisted of 9 men and 3 women. All of us were white. This may be an appropriate juncture to discuss the racial dynamics of the case, or at least how I viewed them. In short, I thought the racial element was like parsley on a dinner plate. It didn't add or detract from the meal, but given a chance, it could have a positive or negative impact. Ultimately, I think this element played little to no role in our verdict, but it existed, and I felt it throughout the experience. It lent an Americana familiarity to the proceedings. Before getting into racial specifics, I want to share my feelings regarding these matters. I think an understanding of my perspective on these issues may help contextually. At the end of my first day at the courthouse, when the jury had just been selected, an alternate juror casually mentioned to me while leaving the courthouse, "That's odd, a black defendant and a black victim, and an all-white jury." I replied, "Funny, I didn't even notice that." And I didn't at that point. The jury pool included black residents of Delaware County, but the jury that was selected was all white. An individual's race is not the first element that I take into account when initially meeting someone. Gender and age have a much larger initial impact upon me than race. Once I was working at a corporate job, and the department head was a black female. A friend of mine was interviewing for a job at the same company and asked me about her. I told my friend a bit about this woman's technical background, her work experience, things of that nature. I didn't mention she was black because that was not an important way for me to describe her, at least in my mind. When I talked with my friend to inquire on how the interview went, the first thing he said was, "You didn't tell me she was black." It wasn't a piece of information that I consciously excluded. Rather, to me, the race factor was tantamount to telling my friend about her shoe size. It just didn't matter in the context of the interview, at least in my mind. I was raised in a middle-class environment, and our neighborhood was mostly white. There were about 100 houses in our development, and 2 of these houses had black families. These 2 homes were my close neighbors, so I played with black kids almost daily while growing up. We also lived close to an Air Force base, and my friends and I used to jump the security fence and go play on the base gym's facilities. It was great. We had an indoor basketball court, racquetball courts, weight room, steam bath, sauna, all for free. We used to go almost every day after school. There were many black military personnel on base, and we played basketball against them daily. In our house, my mother was a registered nurse. She had a medical perspective while dealing with people, and an individual's race is largely a non-factor when viewed in a medical context. I do remember when one of the black families moved into our neighborhood, my mom went over to the house and brought them a homemade cake to welcome them into the neighborhood. One of our white neighbors, a crotchety old widow, then came over to our house and called my mother a, quote, nigger lover, unquote. My mother was such a caring and giving person that having her called that really said more about the woman who made the comment than my mom. I was only 6 or 7 at the time, but I can remember feeling how out of touch and behind the times I felt that white neighbor was. I'm not saying I have no racial bias. I think most people do to some measure. Edward R. Murrow once said, quote, everyone is a prisoner of his own experiences. No one can eliminate prejudices, just recognize them, unquote. I just initially think of other characteristics about a person before I consider race. In psychological terms, I also believe I have what is considered an introvert personality type. The term introvert has a negative connotation in our social context, but psychologically, it's just a defined personality type, just as an extrovert is. It's only a descriptive term, and there's nothing better or worse in being an introvert or being an extrovert in the psychological sense. Extroverts are overtly affected by external stimuli. External stimuli have a power inherent to them that projects itself upon the extrovert. I was in a science lab one day in high school, and I brought a brown bag lunch into school that day. One day in the lab, I pulled a banana out to snack on. There was a caged monkey in the lab, and when the monkey saw the banana, it went into a frenzy. Everyone was curious as to what was wrong with the monkey, and it took a few seconds for me to realize that it was the sight of the banana. The banana had a power that projected itself upon the monkey. An introvert internalizes the emotional impact of external stimuli. When an introvert is exposed to a stimulus, an emotional response is elicited, but it is tempered against other mitigating emotions. It's evaluated, weighed, and its emotional impact is adjusted accordingly. The extrovert is more primal, more in touch with our animal side. The introvert is more cerebral, more in touch with developed consciousness. Getting back to the case, when I saw the defendant Brian Childs, I saw a black male, but I saw a youth first. When I saw the jury, I realized we were all white, but the gender and age makeup had more of an impact upon me than its racial composition. The judge, prosecutor, and defendant were all black. Obviously, I am not privy to their thoughts, but I am not naive enough to conclude that some element of racial bias didn't enter their minds, even if ever so slightly. Maybe the black judge anticipated a white jury as a hanging jury, quick to convict a black youth. Maybe the prosecutor felt a level of indignity regarding what happens routinely in black neighborhoods, a community that she shares an ethnicity. Maybe Bryant Childs feared that the power of an all-white jury would likely convict him, that by being white, we had no idea what life was like in Chester and had no right to judge him. In other words, maybe he never saw us as a jury of his peers. All of this is just speculation on my part, but 12 white jurors held the sole power in determining the fate of a black youth charged with a horrific crime. In America today, how could race not play some sort of role? I also want to point out some authenticity aspects involved with this story. It has most always been the case that regardless of the cultural or social framework, street crimes, like armed robbery, assault, breaking and entering, etc., are more pervasive in poor neighborhoods as compared to more affluent ones. In the mid-1800s, crime was rampant in the immigrant slums of the 5 Points neighborhood in Lower Manhattan. At that time, those immigrants were mostly white Irish or Dutch. Today, many poor urban neighborhoods are black. Therefore, it is not surprising that black-on-black street crime is more prevalent, in terms of racial composition, than other ethnic or interracial crime. This true narrative involves aspects concerned with typically tragic repeated crime in our country. In America today, popular culture prefers sensationalized stories that have emotional extremism woven throughout the plotline. Consequently, in terms of a dramatically charged tale, some might think this story more compelling if there was a white victim and a black defendant, or some other type of racial conflict inherent to the case. The movies To Kill a Mockingbird or Mississippi Burning come to mind. Rather than appealing to atypical vehemence, this account is more about a recurring disturbing trend in America and the reasons behind its presence as a societal norm. In actuality, dramatized emotional extremism is rare. Plotlines and true life stories typically change gradually and tediously. American society is under a constant barrage of shallow, quick-fix, sensationalized entertainment like The Matrix, or Terminator 3, or Hunger Games. If entertainment was food, we'd be hooked on Slurpees, candy bars, and microwaved burritos. All that considered, there is something to be said about the value of realism. Because something is real, it cuts to the core of a person in a manner that fabricated sensationalism does not. Factual stories can stay with people longer and have more of an extended impact than disposable extremism that panders to our primal likings. Sometimes society is better served by what it needs rather than by what it wants. Another popular dramatic practice is to consciously sensationalize fact into a news entertainment product, sometimes called infotainment. This story might be better dramatized and popularized if the racial aspect is propagated and presented in a manner that conjures up racial strife for plotline purposes. Someone calling another a bigot, or depicting a system as racially prejudiced, or a similar dramatic tactic, is easier to comprehend and grasp and stirs emotional vigor quickly. Trying to understand an event independently and intellectually, without an ideological agenda, just doesn't have the short-term emotional verve as the aforementioned approach. For these and many other reasons, it's my opinion that America has always been racially dysfunctional. It's part of the fabric of America. The Constitution declared that all men were created equal, unless, of course, your ancestors were African. The country's father, George Washington, owned slaves. Another founding father, whose bust is carved on Mount Rushmore, Thomas Jefferson, was a staunch abolitionist, yet owned over 200 slaves. He fathered children with slave Sally Heming. President Grant led thousands of Union troops to their deaths in a war to free slaves, yet endorsed efforts to ship blacks back to Africa. Today we have reparations, affirmative action, racial quotas, etc., etc. Considerations based upon race have always been a part of American jurisprudence. Whether necessary or not, this has sustained an inherent contradiction to the pursuit of a judicial process free of race, gender, religious, and ancestral bias. I'm reminded of a quote from Gandhi: "Be the change you wish to see in the world." This is a debate larger than this story, but I wanted to mention it for contextual reasons. I do not wish this work to become a racial commentary. As cited previously, I think it had little or no impact upon our reaching a verdict. That said, the awareness of racial preconceptions regarding a multitude of aspects in this case was material, as it is and always has been in America. I was juror number 3, and in the courtroom I was assigned to sit in the center of the first row of the jury box. Alternatively, in the jury room, we did not sit in the exact same chairs throughout the trial, but in just about the same proximity in the room. Man is a creature of habit, I guess. I tried to sit in a slightly different location each day just to increase the feel of a group dynamic. I didn't want people to feel they had their own territory, literally or figuratively. I also didn't want to come off as wanting to be the jury foreman before the topic came up, so I didn't suggest that we change seat locations. On Friday morning, I brought bagels into the jury room for us just to try to make a difficult task somewhat easier, even in the slightest degree. The jury sat around a conference table, and I was seated on the long side of the table just left of center. From my left, going clockwise, the jurors consisted of the following people. Frank. He was an ex-military man and was currently working for Boeing as an engineer. He served 23 years in the U.S. Military Infantry Division. Part of his time was with the famed 101st Airborne Division. He spent many years in Korea and enlisted just after the Vietnam War. He was originally from Philadelphia and returned here after his military service. He was married, in his mid-50s, was about 5 feet 9 inches tall, and had brown graying hair. His controlled military background was evident. He didn't speak unless there was strong value to his statements. He thought and spoke in a structured, methodical way. There was a way to do things and a way not to do things, and not much in between those two extremes. He was intelligent, courteous, and professional, but he was confident in how his mind worked and how structured thinking was preferable in most every situation. Brian. I can't recollect what Brian's profession was, but like Frank, he valued a structured approach to thinking and life. He was married, in his mid-40s, with a couple of kids. He brought in a book titled Joshua, and sometimes commented about his church activities. He was about 6 feet tall and a slightly pudgy 225 pounds or so. I wouldn't say he was a born-again Christian, but I'd say he had a strong Christian value system that seemed to be not entirely Catholic. He was likely a Protestant, maybe a Presbyterian, and I had the feeling that the church played a large role in his life, although the vast majority of his statements were secular in nature. He sat next to me in the jury box and often twitched his leg like a child on a long airplane flight. He was also kind, courteous, and intelligent, but I also would say slightly immature and naive. He wore golf shirts that were too tight for his chubby frame and pants that did not reach his shoes. He seemed like a typical family man who works 50 weeks a year, and one of his 2 vacation weeks is spent in Orlando in the late spring, and the other at the Jersey Shore in the summer. I have no doubt that he is a dedicated father. Larry. He was a well-groomed, clean-cut, honest, nice guy. He used styling gel in his hair, which indicated to me his appearance was important to him. He was in either his late 30s or early 40s. He was married probably less than 10 years. He was intelligent, well-spoken, gentle, and empathetic. He could fit in as a mid to senior level manager in an insurance company. He was about 5 feet 9 inches tall and fit, maybe around 170 pounds. He was obviously college educated. Mary Ann. She was in her mid-40s and seemed like a kind, streetwise person. She was Catholic, maybe of Irish descent. She likely had brothers and sisters while growing up. She was married and a mom to at least one kid in elementary school. She had a warm, kindly demeanor, and she was smarter than what her vernacular and accent suggested. I had the feeling that she could have gone on and received her bachelor's degree, but decided to do other things when she finished high school. Maybe she got her associate's degree, and perhaps she went on and earned her bachelor's at night school. She struck me as the type of person who was intelligent, but aspects of her life other than education interceded in her early adulthood, and she took on the role of mother rather than working professional. She was a caring person, and I bet a great mother, spouse, and friend. Jim. He was in his late 40s and worked for Verizon. He was involved with computer ISDN networks on the level of manually running cable and jobs of that nature. He had a son in college and was born and raised in the Philadelphia area. He was a big college basketball fan, as I was at one time. Quietly competent was how I would describe him. He was about 6 feet 5 inches tall, lanky, and had salt and pepper graying hair. He was also an intelligent guy, but if he was a boxer, he'd be a counterpuncher. He wouldn't take the initiative to offer much of his thoughts, but he was always thinking, taking in all of the discussions. A silent river running deep might be a good description. He was aware of the tone of conversation and picked his times to interject in an opportunistic fashion. He was cagey and wise, and if he was a baseball batter, he'd wait for the right pitch, as Wade Boggs used to do. Vince. Philadelphia has a large Italian heritage, and Vince was a part of it. He was also a military veteran. I would guess his education went as far as high school. He had silver gray hair, combed back. His skin was olive-colored, and his stature was that of the size of Al Pacino. He may have been of Sicilian descent. After the military, he worked in the union at a local oil refinery. He was another kind man and had wisdom that can only be acquired through age. He was one of the chattier ones in our group, but always in a nice, non-offensive, jovial tone. He retired recently. Carl. He was also a military veteran and the oldest in the group. He was in his 60s, maybe even pushing 70. He had no more than a high school education, if that. He was about 6 feet 2 inches tall, and you can tell his frame had once carried more weight at a younger age. He looked like he was of German descent. He had silver hair combed back and was a smoker for at least 30 years. His chiseled complexion showed it. He reminded me of a cross between Jack Palance and Charles Bronson. He wore his black silk Union jacket with his name embroidered on it each day. Either he or Jim talked the least in the group. Again, he had wisdom that could only be acquired through age and experience. He often mumbled when he spoke, but you had the feeling his brain thought complex ideas that his tongue couldn't convey. Go to any VFW post, and you'll see a few of his type at the bar. A hard worker, nice guy with a lot of World War II generation still in him. Jen. She was in her early 30s and petite in stature. She was just 8 weeks pregnant and worked in a local hospital, but I'm not sure in what capacity. I don't think she was a nurse, but maybe a technician or administrator or a therapist. She was bright and a good conversationalist. She was originally from Westchester County in New York. She told me that she was, quote, raised Jewish, unquote. She had a direct, linear, engaging intellect that I had often encountered in Jewish classmates while I attended college in New York State. She also had the empathy of a woman and expectant mother. Maybe the new life growing inside her magnified her desire to help bestow a virtuous society for her child to inherit. She indicated that she had worked previously with disadvantaged youth. She obviously had a college education. She shared with us that her father was an attorney. She was a smart person with a compassionate heart. Ellen. She was in her late 30s to early 40s. She was a smoker and had acutely developed street smarts. She was probably raised in a blue-collar environment. She was married and a mother to at least one child. She also struck me as a person who was smarter than the level of formal education she acquired. Her dialect and language was that of a convenience store clerk, yet the content of what she had to say was perceptive, valuable, and tangible. I think her life had a way of steering her rather than her steering life. She was very kind and empathetic and had a very tender heart, housed inside a slightly rough exterior. She needed to take smoking breaks on occasion, and you could tell that nicotine deprivation would cause her anxiety if not addressed in a timely fashion. Tim. He was by far the most vocal in the group. He also worked in oil refineries inspecting petroleum tanks. If a Philadelphian has a stereotype, Tim fit it. He was loud, overbearing, and boisterous, but that's what made him endearing. He'd be the first guy you'd call to go to a football game and the last guy you'd bring to the symphony. He was single, I'd guess in his late 30s to early 40s. He also had salt and pepper graying hair and a tightly trimmed beard. He was about 6 feet 4 inches tall, maybe weighing 220 pounds, and had a chain from his belt loop to his wallet. Emotion controlled his tongue rather than detached critical analysis, yet he offered many valuable insights. His inflammatory tone was an obstacle in deliberations, but if it could be overcome, there was content in what he had to say. Dick. He was single, in his mid-50s, and almost certainly gay. He wasn't what I would call a swishy gay, but rather an intelligent, funny, mild-mannered, good-natured gay man. He was about 6 feet tall, sandy gray hair, and had wire-rimmed glasses. He was very funny, and maybe the most engaging jury member. I also think he made the second best attempt, behind myself, to think critically and independently. He worked for the Social Security office in Philadelphia, and I would guess was putting in his last few years before retirement. He had traveled the world and had a college education. Myself. I'm a white, single, middle-aged male just trying to make his way through 21st century America. Although I am certain, like everyone, my past experiences have formed inherent biases to some degree. I don't think there is anything extraordinary in my past that would exceedingly impact my attempt at an independent approach to this matter. The two alternate jurors were both named Chris, although one was male and one was female. They sat just outside the jury box and did not participate in our deliberations. They were both young, in their 20s, and I think were overtly affected by the graphic nature of the crime and the testimony. We were never allowed to discuss the case while these two were part of the group, so I really had no way of knowing their sentiments and had limited interaction with them. Week on PhillyCentric, a jury foreman is selected, trial witnesses and testimony are discussed, and an article regarding the trial appears in the local newspaper.